My name is Nina Hollowell. I am 31 years old, and until this New Year's, I thought I was just the easy child, the one who never needed much. That morning, my phone lit up with a text from my older sister. No greeting, no smiley face, just one line. Don't come unless you're useful. In my family, useful has never meant kind or present. It has always meant money and signatures, help with deposits, help with credit, paperwork nobody else wants to read. I didn't answer. I set the phone face down and tried to move on. A little later, my parents called. They didn't ask how I was. They went straight to the point. My sister had found her place. The bank needed one more name on the mortgage, and that name should be mine. To them, it was just another favor. To me, it felt like the same old script. Only this time, they said the quiet part out loud. So I said no. When we hung up, I opened my banking app and sent my dad exactly $1 with a note. Hope this helps. I expected a guilt trip. Instead, my sister called immediately, voice raised, throwing every word she knew for selfish at me. I held the phone away from my ear and was seconds from ending the call when she slipped and let one sentence fly, fast and angry. One line that made my stomach drop and told me this wasn't just about a visit or a mortgage anymore. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. That day, my apartment felt smaller than it had that morning. The walls were the same soft beige. The street outside sounded the same. But there was a new weight in the room, as if someone had finally said out loud what I had been dodging for years. In my family, usefulness has always been a quiet currency. Growing up in a modest neighborhood outside Birmingham, the kids who made things easier were rewarded with smiles, and the kids who made messes were forgiven. My older sister, Courtney, fit perfectly into that second category. She brought drama, noise, bad decisions, and somehow still managed to be the one everyone circled around. I learned early that if I kept my grades high and my needs low, the house stayed calm. My father, Martin Hollowell, liked to joke that I was the independent one. He would say I was born ready to take care of myself, as if that were a compliment and not a way to excuse how often I was left to figure things out alone. My mother, Darlene, called my sister her sensitive child and me her steady one. Sensitive meant you were allowed to fall apart. Steady meant you were expected to hold the pieces. The same pattern followed us into adulthood. Courtney bounced between apartments and jobs, always just a little behind. There were late rent notices, overdraft fees, a car payment that went missing until my parents scrambled to fix it. My name showed up whenever a signature was needed that would pass a credit check. At first it was small, like being listed as a backup on a phone plan. Later, it was helping with a security deposit when she promised it was temporary, and she would pay me back once she settled. I learned the hard way that temporary can stretch for years when the person saying it never plans to change. Every favor turned into a quiet line item on a mental ledger I never shared with anyone. When I brought it up once, my parents asked why I was keeping score against my own sister. After that, I stopped pushing. It was easier to say nothing than to be told that I was cold. Instead, I did what people like me always do. I worked more hours, built my own savings, paid my own loans, and kept a careful distance that looked, from the outside, like selfishness. When I skipped holidays, my parents told relatives I was busy with my job. When I skipped calls, they said I was tired. The truth was simpler. Being around them felt like standing on the edge of a conversation where everyone had agreed on a story and nobody planned to ask if I believed it. That is why the word useful hits different for me. It is not about being helpful in the normal way. It means being available on demand. It means saying yes before you see the paperwork. It means being the adult in the room and then being blamed for acting like one. Courtney learned that if she pushed hard enough and cried long enough, someone would step in. I learned that if I stepped in, the fallout became my responsibility. My life in the city is not fancy, but it is stable. I have a small place I pay for on my own, and a job that covers my bills without needing anybody else's name. The distance, both in miles and in habits, has been my way of staying sane. I thought it was enough to keep the old patterns from finding me. I told myself that if I answered less, they would depend on me less. The morning before New Year's proved how wrong that assumption was. One text, one demand, one expectation that nothing had changed. Under all their talk about family, about being there for each other, the same old truth was still running underneath like a cracked foundation. In their eyes, I was the reliable signature waiting on the sidelines, whether I liked it or not. Standing in the middle of my quiet living room, phone still in my hand, I finally let myself look at that pattern without softening it. My parents had built an entire system around the idea that my sister would always need rescuing, and that I would always be available to do the rescuing. Saying no did not just interrupt their plans for a mortgage, it challenged the story they told themselves about who I was. I was tired in ways I could not name. For the first time, I wondered what else that story might be hiding. The following afternoon, the air in my apartment felt different, like the moment after someone slams a door in another room. Nothing had moved, but it was impossible to pretend the morning had been normal. I sat at the small table by my window and replayed my sister's outburst in my head, this time without the volume. When I stripped away the insults and the anger, what stayed was that one offhand line about paperwork, about things already being in her name. It did not sound like a threat thrown in the heat of the moment. It sounded like something she believed was already settled. I have never been the kind of person who enjoys digging through legal documents. I work in operations, not law, and my idea of a decent evening used to be cooking something simple and letting a show run in the background. That afternoon, though, I opened my laptop and went looking for answers in places I had ignored for years. The first place I checked was my email. After my grandfather died, my parents forwarded me a message from an attorney with attachments I barely skimmed. Back then, I was still in school, more focused on exams than on whatever arrangement the adults were building. It took a while to find the thread buried under newsletters and password reminders, but it was still there. The attorney had attached a summary of my grandfather's estate. The language was dense and written for people who understood it better than I did. Reading it again with different eyes, one section finally cut through the noise. The house my father grew up in, the one my parents still lived in, was supposed to be held in a trust until both of their children reached a certain age. After that, it said, it would belong to us in equal shares. My name was there beside my sister's, not as a footnote, but as an owner. I stared at the screen. If the house was meant to be split, how could my sister talk as if everything had already been arranged around her? Either she was bluffing to push me into cooperation, or someone had quietly rewritten the story on paper without ever mentioning it to me. I printed the summary and set it on the table, then pulled up the county website for property records. The site was clunky and slow, but it was still a way to see what the record showed. I typed in my parents' address, hit search, and waited while the page loaded a list of filings I had never paid attention to before. There were old entries from before I was born, a refinance when I was a teenager, a couple of routine updates. Then there was a recent item with a description that made my throat go dry. It pointed to a change in who controlled the property on paper. My own name was nowhere in that entry. Seeing it there felt different from hearing rumors or angry comments. This was not family drama. It was a record in a system that treated the change as fact. Whatever had been done with that house, it had been recorded without my signature and without any conversation that included me. For a few minutes, I sat still, listening to the traffic outside and the hum of my refrigerator, trying to decide if I was overreacting. Maybe there was some update to the trust that still protected me somehow, even if my name had dropped off the most recent filings. That was the kind of explanation my parents would probably offer if I asked. The truth was simpler. When anything touched money or property, my family closed ranks and spoke in half sentences. I had watched them smooth over late bills, missing payments, and quiet favors for years. Looking at a document that treated me like a stranger to the house I grew up in, all of those small choices lined up into something I could not ignore. I knew I could not untangle this alone. I did not speak the language of deeds and trusts well enough to see every risk, and I was not willing to guess my way through it. Staying quiet and hoping for the best was how I had ended up here in the first place. On the corner of the printed summary, I wrote down the document number from the county site and the questions I could not answer. Then, I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact I had saved but rarely touched. A friend of a friend who worked with estates and property disputes. I hesitated, thinking about how strange it felt to turn my family into a file on someone's desk. The hesitation did not last long. Later that week, I sat in a small office on the edge of downtown Birmingham with a manila folder balanced on my knees. The room was plain and quiet, the kind of place built for paperwork rather than feelings. It suited what I was there to do. Jenna Collins, the attorney my coworker had recommended, took the folder and spread the contents out on her desk. We had shaken hands, traded a few polite sentences about parking and traffic, and then she asked me to start from the part that worried me most. I told her I had grown up in a house my parents still lived in, that my grandfather's estate had put it in a trust for his grandchildren, and that recent records no longer seemed to know I existed. She did not react to the summary. She reacted to the documents. First, she read through the estate papers my parents had forwarded years ago, the ones I had printed and highlighted in my kitchen. She moved slowly, following each paragraph with a pen until she reached the section describing what should happen to the house, a trust holding the property. Equal shares once both grandchildren reached a certain age. No conditions, no special treatment for the one who needed more help. Jenna drew a small mark in the margin next to that paragraph and nodded once, more to herself than to me. Then she picked up the county record I had printed from the public database, the entry showing a recent change in control. The language was dry, but the effect was not. On that page, there was no hint of split ownership. It named a single person with authority over the property, and that person was not me. She sat back for a moment, tapping the pen lightly against the desk, then laid the two documents side by side. On one sheet, my grandfather's instructions. On the other, the present tense version of my family's story. The gap between them was the space my parents had never mentioned on the phone. Jenna explained what she saw in simple terms. A trust is not a suggestion. It is a structure meant to carry someone's wishes forward after they are gone. If property inside that structure ends up controlled by one beneficiary in a way that cuts another out, there should be a paper trail showing how that happened. Signatures, amendments, notices, not just silence and a new filing. If that property is being used to back a loan or a mortgage, she said, the lender expects that anyone with a legal interest has either signed off or been properly bought out. When that is not clear, banks and title companies get nervous. Nervous institutions investigate. They put things on hold. They start asking questions I have a right to ask first. Listening to her talk, I felt my shoulders go rigid. For years, my parents had treated my discomfort as an overreaction. In that office, the imbalance did not look dramatic. It looked deliberate. Someone had made choices that assumed I would never go looking for proof. Jenna outlined what I could do next. The first step was not a lawsuit, it was a letter. I would ask my parents, in writing, for a full copy of the trust and any changes made since my grandfather died. I would ask for copies of any deeds, transfers, or agreements that touched the house. I would ask why the most recent record no longer showed the split ownership described in the estate summary. She drafted the letter while I watched. The language was calm and technical. It did not accuse anyone of stealing. It did not threaten to drag the family into court. It simply reminded them that I was a named beneficiary, and that I needed documents and explanations to understand how my interest had been handled. We went over each line until it sounded like something I would actually say. Then I signed it. Jenna scanned a copy for her file and handed the original back to me with a short list of practical instructions. Email it so they saw it quickly. Send it again by certified mail so nobody could say it never arrived. Save the receipts. Mark down the day I sent it and give them a reasonable deadline. When I stepped back out into the parking lot, the air felt colder than when I had walked in. The envelope in my bag was light. Just a few sheets of paper and a signature. But it changed the shape of what came next. For the first time, my questions about that house were not a private frustration I carried alone. They were written down, addressed to the people who had treated my share as optional, and they could not be taken back. By the end of the holiday weekend, my questions were no longer just thoughts in my head. My parents had seen them in writing. Whether they answered or not, they could not act as if nothing had been sent. I did not hear from them directly. There was no email with documents, no call offering an explanation. The silence itself became an answer. When something in our family did not fit the story my parents liked, it was set aside until everyone learned not to mention it. This time, there was a record they could not hide. On the second evening after the deadline I had given them, my phone lit up with a name I did not expect. My aunt, Teresa Hollowell, rarely called. She sent birthday messages and left comments on family photos, but she stayed away from conflict. I let the call go to voicemail and listened a minute later. Her message was brief. She said she had heard there was some confusion about the house, that she did not want to take sides, and that there was something I might want to look up in the public records if I had not done it already. She did not mention my sister. She did not say my parents' names. She only referenced a piece of land behind the house that my grandfather had treated as separate from the yard. When the message ended, I replayed the last part. A piece of land behind the house. Growing up, we had called it the back lot, a strip past the fence where my grandfather kept an extra shed and a small garden that never produced much. I had not thought about it in years. To me, it was just part of the property. To my aunt, it sounded like something else. I wrote down the parcel description as best I could remember it and pulled up the county website again. This time, I did not search the street address. I opened the section for parcel numbers and followed the prompts until I found the entry that matched the backlot. The page loaded slowly, but when it appeared, I felt the same tightening in my chest I had felt the first time I looked up the house. The lot was still linked to my grandfather's trust by name, but the most recent filing showed a different kind of activity. Several months earlier, someone had used that narrow piece of land as part of the security for a line of credit. The lender listed was not the same bank my parents used for their mortgage. The borrower was a limited liability company I recognized from other conversations in my family, a company tied to my father. Nothing about that arrangement mentioned me. There was no sign that anyone had checked whether both beneficiaries of the trust had agreed to let that happen. On paper, it looked like a way to pull value from something most people would overlook. In practice, it meant someone had taken a piece of property, meant for both grandchildren, and folded it into a separate plan. I saved a copy of the record and emailed it to Jenna with a short note. She called back early the next morning. Her tone was steady, but there was no attempt to soften what she said. From her perspective, the pattern had become clearer. There was the main house, meant to be divided. There was the backlot, still named in the trust. There were filings that shifted control of those assets without the kind of signatures she expected to see from all the people named in the original estate papers. She talked me through what might happen once a title company or a lender realized there was an unresolved interest. They would need clarification before moving forward with any transaction that touched the property. That could mean delays, holds, or requests for formal releases. If questions about disclosure went deeper, it could become something more serious. Listening to her outline those possibilities, I felt less like a daughter being difficult and more like someone who had been written out of a contract she was supposed to be part of. I had spent years second-guessing whether my discomfort made me ungrateful. Looking at the records with Jenna, it felt less like ingratitude and more like basic self-respect. By the time we ended the call, we had agreed on 2 concrete steps. She would notify the parties involved with the line of credit that there was a potential issue with the underlying ownership, and she would file whatever was needed to make my interest visible in the public record, not just buried in an old email from an attorney. My job was simpler and harder at the same time. I needed to hold my ground while the systems around my family did what they were supposed to do. As the new week began, the fallout from those filings arrived in small, unmistakable ways. It showed up as quiet reactions from systems that cared only about signatures. The first sign was a message from Jenna. The lender reviewing the mortgage tied to my parents' house had received her notice about the ownership issue and done the predictable thing. It moved the file into review. The loan was no longer drifting toward approval. Nothing had been denied yet, but nothing was moving. I pictured my sister taking a call from her loan officer, hearing that a planned move-in date had turned into a question mark. The problem was not the payment she could afford each month. It was the story behind the property, the part nobody expected me to check. The next ripple came from my parents. They still did not answer the letter. Instead, they tried to redirect everything back into private space. My mother sent a long email full of memories and worry, but no attachments. She wrote about what my grandparents had given, how delicate my sister had been, how relieved she was that I could handle my own life. Reading it, I could see the outline of the same message as always. If I kept pushing, I would be choosing paperwork over people. My father followed with a shorter note. He mentioned the trust once, just long enough to say that professionals had handled it years ago and that I was reading into phrases I did not understand. If I wanted clarity, he suggested, we could sit down together after the mortgage closed and walk through it as a family. There was no offer to send the documents I had requested. I forwarded both emails to Jenna and went back to my desk. On the surface, my days stayed ordinary. I answered project questions, sat in video meetings, and refilled my coffee. Underneath, every vibration from my phone felt like another attempt to pull me back into the role I was trying to leave behind. Jenna's reply was calm. From her perspective, my parents' messages confirmed what we already suspected. They were trying to pull the conversation off the record and back into a living room, where tone and guilt could blur what had actually been filed. She reminded me that my questions were now tied to specific documents. That trail existed whether anyone chose to respond or not. A few days later, she forwarded an update from a title company involved with the line of credit on the back lot. The company had added a condition. Before it would ensure any transaction that involved that strip of land, it wanted proof that all beneficiaries of the trust had either agreed to the way it was being used or been properly bought out. For the first time since my grandfather died, my name appeared where it belonged, not in a family story, but in a list of people whose signatures might be required. That change altered the weight of everything. For years, saying no to my family had felt like a kind of betrayal. Now people who did not know me at all were treating my absence from the paperwork as the real problem. The imbalance I had been told to ignore had finally run into a system that insisted on symmetry before it would move another dollar. Sleep came in uneven pieces. I would drift off, and then wake with my jaw tight, replaying scenes at my parents' table where hard questions were smoothed over until they vanished. This time the questions were attached to reference numbers and deadlines. My parents could ignore my letter. They could not ignore a lender or a title officer without consequences they could not spin away. Jenna told me the next step would likely be a formal setting where the trust questions would be laid out in order. It might be a meeting with lawyers or a session in front of someone assigned to sort through disputed inheritances. She warned me that it would feel slow and technical, more about who owned what and when than about who had been hurt. I blocked off time on my calendar around the date she expected things to move and cleared as much space as my job allowed. At home, I gathered every printout into a stack on my coffee table. Each page represented a choice someone in my family had made about that house or that narrow strip of land without expecting me to ever read it. For most of my life, my role had been to keep the peace, to step in quietly when someone else stumbled and then disappear from the story. Looking at the stack of folders, I understood that this time I was not disappearing. Whatever the outcome, the record would show that I had stepped forward and insisted on being counted. When the day finally came, the place where everything would be decided felt strangely ordinary. A glass-walled conference room downtown, neutral carpet, a long table, and a stack of folders holding my grandfather's trust, the property records, and the emails my parents had never expected me to read twice. I sat beside Jenna and watched the chairs across from us fill. My parents and my sister took their seats with their attorney between them. The greetings were short and professional. Then the room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than shouting. My mother stared at a legal pad she never wrote on. My sister traced circles with her thumb along the edge of her phone and never once met my eyes. The discussion started with the documents that came first. The sections of the estate plan about the house and the narrow strip of land behind it were read aloud. The wording was stiff, but the point was simple. The trust held the property for 2 grandchildren, not for one favored child with a louder voice. Once we reached the age my grandfather had chosen, our shares were meant to be equal. There was no clause that allowed someone to quietly edit me out. Then the newer papers were set on the table. The transfer that put control of the house into a single name was reviewed line by line. The filing that used the backlot as collateral for a line of credit tied to my father's company went through the same treatment. Dates, signatures, recording numbers, all in front of us. Each time a document treated my interest as if it did not exist, Jenna paused and asked who had approved that step and where my consent was recorded. My parents leaned on the language of confusion. They said they had followed advice, tried to keep things simple, believed that as long as everything stayed in the family, nobody would be hurt. Their attorney talked about informal understandings and decisions made around kitchen tables instead of conference tables. He suggested that the forms might not reflect every conversation they remembered having. Jenna let the explanations sit there, and then brought the focus back to the pages. Whatever anyone meant to do, the result was clear. A trust written for 2 people had been reshaped so that only one could act. Lenders and title companies had already seen that gap. That was why mortgages and credit lines connected to the property were no longer moving freely. The record itself had started pushing back long before I walked into the room. Eventually, the options narrowed to 2 lines on a page. We could leave the filings in place and argue with banks, insurers, and possibly a judge every time someone tried to move money around those parcels. Or we could unwind the changes and correct the record so it matched what my grandfather had written from the start. One path protected a version of family harmony that depended on me staying small. The other protected the structure of the trust and admitted that the harmony had never been real. Sitting at that table, I realized the choice had almost nothing to do with square footage or appraised value. It was about whether I would keep paying for peace with silence. Letting the current structure stand would confirm the role I had been assigned since childhood. The reliable one who did not complain, no matter what. Insisting on correction would put distance between us that no holiday invitation could cover. I chose the distance. With Jenna shaping the language, we agreed that the house and the back lot would be recorded again as belonging to both grandchildren in equal shares. Any future attempt to use those properties as collateral would either require my signature or a proper purchase of my interest at a fair price. Without that, nobody would be able to sign one more line and pretend I was a ghost in the background of my own family. We signed the documents that set those terms in motion. The pen felt heavier than usual, not with triumph, but with finality. When the meeting ended, my parents stood and left with their attorney. My sister walked out without a word. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded smaller than what had just changed. Over the next few weeks, the consequences settled into place. The clear timeline my sister had described for her mortgage dissolved into delays and new conditions. The line of credit tied to the backlot had to be rewritten with my name on the pages that counted. My parents spent time and money answering questions from people who did not care about family stories, only about clean records and genuine consent. None of that repaired trust. It just meant the cost of their choices finally showed up on their side of the ledger. I adjusted my life around that new reality. Calls from their numbers went straight to voicemail. Emails were skimmed when I felt steady enough and forwarded to Jenna when they touched anything legal. Holidays became empty weekends instead of tests. I could fail by saying no. The house in Birmingham turned into a mailing address and a line in a system, not a place where I was expected to arrive on demand. Looking back now, I do not see a neat revenge arc. I see a boundary that finally stayed where I put it. Saying no cost me contact, comfort, and the illusion that we all wanted the same future. Staying quiet would have cost me the belief that my share of this story mattered as much as anyone else's. One price is sharp and immediate. The other lingers for years and teaches you that your needs are optional. If any part of this feels familiar, I hope it gives you permission to question the roles you have been handed and decide which ones still deserve you. You are allowed to stop being useful in ways that erase you. You are allowed to choose your own side and stay there, even if other people do not approve. Thank you for listening to my story. If it made you think about your own boundaries, you can share your thoughts or pass this along to someone who might need to hear it.